The afternoon sun beat down on Jacksonville's Riverside neighborhood with the relentless intensity that only a Florida August could deliver. Veronica Castellano stood at the kitchen sink of her second-floor apartment, washing paint from her hands. The turpentine smell mixed with the salt breeze coming through the window she'd propped open with a dictionary. At 29 years old, she'd finally started calling herself an artist without apologizing for it. Her abstract landscapes were beginning to sell at a small gallery on King Street. Not enough to quit her day job at the University of North Florida Library, but enough to validate the choice she'd made 3 years earlier when she'd walked away from her accounting degree and picked up a paintbrush instead. She was making dinner for her brother Marcus and his family the next night. One meal at a time, trying to rebuild the bridge with her parents who'd called her reckless for choosing art over security. She grabbed her keys and her canvas tote bag, locked the door behind her, and headed to the corner market for ingredients. She didn't know that within 3 hours she would be dead. Stabbed 19 times in her own bedroom by someone she trusted enough to let through her door. For 18 years, her killer would live across the hall in apartment 2D. He'd pretend to mourn. He'd express shock and sadness to neighbors. He'd even volunteer his DNA to investigators. And he'd get away with it because that DNA sample would mysteriously come back as not a match. But in 2023, a discarded Starbucks cup and cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy would finally crack this case wide open, leading to an arrest that would shake Jacksonville to its core and reveal a secret so disturbing that even seasoned detectives would struggle to process it. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is at your location. Have you ever lived next to someone and later discovered something shocking about them? Let us know in the comments. And if you're into deep dives on cold cases that finally get solved, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who appreciates real investigative storytelling. Veronica Castellano wasn't supposed to be an artist. At least, that's what her mother Diana had told her repeatedly during their last big argument. The Castellano family had expectations. Her father, Vincent, ran a successful construction business in Jacksonville. Her older brother, Marcus, had followed a respectable path into law enforcement, becoming a detective with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office at just 26. Veronica was supposed to finish her accounting degree, work at a stable firm, maybe marry someone sensible, have kids, build the kind of life you could explain to relatives at Thanksgiving without awkward silences. Instead, at 26, she'd quit her entry-level position at a downtown accounting firm, enrolled in art classes at the community college, and moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Riverside. The neighborhood was caught in that strange phase of transition, artists and young professionals moving in, old problems not quite moved out yet. It was affordable, close to the gallery district, and had the kind of character you couldn't find in the newer suburban developments her parents preferred. Marcus had been the only one who understood. He'd shown up at her new place with a bottle of wine and a housewarming gift. A deadbolt lock he installed himself while giving her a lecture about neighborhood safety. Riverside was gentrifying, he'd explained, which meant it sat in that dangerous middle ground between rough and respectable. Veronica had laughed at his concern, but she'd appreciated it. She knew how to lock her doors, how to walk with purpose, how to read a situation before it went bad. Besides, she liked her neighbors. Mrs. Dolores Hampton in 2C, a retired schoolteacher who baked ziti every Sunday and always made extra. The college students in 2A were loud on weekends but friendly enough, always holding the door if they saw you coming with groceries. Kyle Brennan in 2D, directly across the hall from Veronica, was quiet and helpful. An IT consultant who worked from home, kept irregular hours, but always had a polite smile and a wave when they crossed paths in the hallway. By August of 2005, Veronica had been living in the building for nearly a year. Her paintings were starting to sell, not enough to live on yet, but enough to make her believe she'd made the right choice. She was slowly rebuilding the relationship with her parents, letting them see that she wasn't being reckless, just brave. Tomorrow's dinner with Marcus, his wife, and their 2 kids was part of that bridge building. She'd planned the menu carefully: pasta with homemade marinara, garlic bread, a salad, the kind of meal that said she had her life together. On the evening of August 14th, she finished cleaning her brushes around 6:30. The apartment smelled like turpentine and dried acrylic. She pulled her dark curly hair into a ponytail, grabbed her keys and the canvas tote bag that said, "Read Banned Books," and headed out. Mrs. Hampton was watering the plants in the hallway, a routine she kept religiously every other day. "Going to the store, honey?" she asked, looking up with a warm smile. "Just to Marco's," Veronica replied, naming the small grocery 3 blocks away. "Need anything?" "I'm fine, dear. You be careful." "Always am." Veronica walked down the stairs and out into the thick evening heat. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows between the buildings. She made the walk to Marco's in about 10 minutes, picked up tomatoes, fresh basil, mozzarella, a box of pasta, a loaf of Italian bread. She chatted with Marco himself at the register, an older man who knew most of his regular customers by name. He asked about her paintings. She told him about a recent sale. He congratulated her with genuine warmth. She left the store at 7:10, the canvas bag heavy with groceries, and made the walk back to her building. Mrs. Hampton, now watering the ferns on the landing between the 1st and 2nd floors, saw her return around 7:15. "Get everything you needed?" Mrs. Hampton called up. "Yep, all set for tomorrow," Veronica said, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs with the bag. She disappeared into her apartment, the door closing with its familiar click. What Mrs. Hampton didn't know, what no one knew at the time, was that someone in that building had been watching Veronica for months, tracking her routines, documenting her movements, building an obsession that was about to turn deadly. Those were the last words Mrs. Hampton would ever hear Veronica speak. Marcus Castellano called his sister 3 times on the morning of August 15th. The first call at 8:17 a.m. went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Ronnie wasn't a morning person. She'd probably silenced her phone and was sleeping in before her shift at the library. The second call at 9:45 a.m. also went unanswered. Now he left a message. "Hey, just confirming tonight. Jess is making her lemon cake. Kids are excited. Call me back." The third call came at 11:30, after his wife Jessica had gotten off the phone with the University of North Florida Library. Veronica hadn't shown up for her shift. She hadn't called. That wasn't like her. Ronnie was reliable, especially about work. She needed that job to pay rent while her art career grew. Marcus felt it then, that cold drop in his stomach that every detective knows, the one that says something is wrong. He told his captain he needed a personal hour and drove to Riverside faster than he should have. Parked crooked at the curb outside her building. Took the stairs 2 at a time, his hand already reaching for his phone to call for backup if needed, but hoping desperately that he was overreacting. That he'd knock and she'd answer, looking annoyed that he'd worried, that there'd be some simple explanation like a dead phone battery or food poisoning keeping her home. He knocked hard on 2B. "Ronnie, it's Marcus. Open up." Nothing. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. Knocked again, harder. Then he called her cell one more time and heard it. The muffled ringtone coming from inside the apartment. She was in there. Why wasn't she answering? Kyle Brennan stepped out of apartment 2D, looking concerned. "Everything okay, Detective Castellano?" Marcus had met Kyle a few times when visiting his sister. Nice enough guy. Quiet. "Can't get hold of my sister. You seen her?" "Not since yesterday afternoon," Kyle said. "I heard her come home last night around 7, maybe 7:15. Haven't heard anything since." Marcus knocked again, louder. "Ronnie, this isn't funny. Answer the door." Mrs. Hampton emerged from 2C, her face creased with worry. "I saw her come back from the store last night. She was fine. What's happening?" "I need the building manager," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Now." Mrs. Hampton hurried downstairs, while Marcus stood there, his training battling his rising panic. Locked door, phone inside, no answer, no signs of forced entry on the door frame. Maybe she'd fallen, hit her head. Maybe she needed help and couldn't get to the door. Ray Gomez, the building manager, arrived within 3 minutes, fumbling with his massive keyring. His hand shook as he tried to find the master key. "Hurry up," Marcus said. The lock clicked. Marcus pushed the door open. "Ronnie?" The apartment looked normal. No signs of struggle in the living room. Her canvas bag still on the kitchen counter, groceries half put away, tomatoes on the cutting board. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Everything looked peaceful, except the bedroom door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar. Marcus walked toward it, his detective brain already cataloging details. No broken windows, no jimmied locks, no overturned furniture. He pushed the bedroom door open with his foot. Veronica lay on the floor between the bed and the dresser, her white sleep shirt soaked through with dried blood. Her dark curls spread around her head, her eyes open, staring at nothing. The carpet beneath her stained nearly black. Marcus saw the wounds, too many to count in that first horrible moment. Her arms, her chest, her neck, defensive wounds on her hands where she'd tried to fight back. He stumbled backward into the hallway, his legs giving out. He hit the wall and slid down to the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He heard Ray yelling something, heard Mrs. Hampton screaming, heard Kyle's voice saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called it in. Homicide, his sister's address. Officer needs assistance. His voice came out robotic, detached, the only way he could get the words out. Then he sat there on the floor outside her apartment. This crime scene that used to be his little sister's home, and he couldn't stop shaking. The question that would haunt him, that would haunt this entire case, started forming even through his grief. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were secure. How did the killer get in? And more terrifying still, how did they get out? Detective Angela Reeves had been with Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Homicide Unit for 12 years when she caught the Castellano case. She was known for 2 things: her methodical approach to evidence and her near-perfect clearance rate. But this case carried extra weight. The victim's brother was one of their own. Marcus Castellano had been removed from any involvement, but everyone knew he'd be watching every move, second-guessing every decision. Angela understood. If it were her sister, she'd be the same way. The medical examiner's preliminary report came back within 48 hours. Veronica Castellano had died from multiple stab wounds, 19 in total. The concentrated areas were her chest, abdomen, and neck. She had significant defensive wounds on her forearms and palms, deep cuts that indicated she'd fought hard, tried to grab the blade, tried to survive. The weapon appeared to be a knife with a 4 to 5 inch blade, possibly serrated. Time of death was estimated between 7:30 and 9:45 p.m. on August 14th. What struck Angela immediately was the sheer violence of it. 19 stab wounds wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was rage. This was personal. This was someone who either knew Veronica or had developed a fixation on her. But the crime scene itself presented a puzzle that didn't make sense. There was no forced entry. None. The deadbolt that Marcus had installed himself showed no signs of tampering. The windows were all locked from the inside. The door had been secured with both the standard lock and the deadbolt when Marcus arrived. So either Veronica had locked the door after her attacker left, which seemed impossible given her injuries, or the killer had a key, or she'd let them in willingly. The crime scene techs did find something useful, though. Blood evidence that didn't belong to Veronica. Not much, just a few small drops near the bedroom doorway and a partial bloody handprint on the wall near her closet. The killer had cut themselves during the attack, possibly on the knife handle, or when Veronica fought back. They'd gotten DNA. In 2005, DNA evidence was becoming the gold standard. This should have been a solvable case. Angela started with the neighbors. Mrs. Dolores Hampton became the key witness. She'd seen Veronica leave for the store around 6:45 p.m., watched her return around 7:15 p.m., carrying her canvas bag. Veronica had been alone both times. But Mrs. Hampton reported something else. Around 8:30 p.m., while watching television, she'd heard raised voices through the walls. She couldn't make out words, couldn't say for certain which apartment they came from, but they were loud enough to notice. One voice was definitely female, possibly Veronica. The other was male, deeper, aggressive. The college students in 2A had alibis. They'd been at a concert downtown, had ticket stubs and photos with timestamps to prove it. They'd gotten home after midnight, seen the police presence, hadn't known what happened until the next morning. Kyle, Brennan, the neighbor in 2D directly across from Veronica, came in for an interview on August 17th. Angela watched him carefully. He was 28, tall and thin with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. An IT consultant who worked from home, doing server maintenance and network security for various clients. He spoke quietly, seemed genuinely distressed about Veronica's death. She was a good neighbor, he told Angela. Quiet, friendly, we'd chat in the hallway sometimes. She told me about her art. I bought one of her paintings, actually, a landscape piece. It's in my living room. Angela noted that detail. Tell me about Sunday night. What were you doing? Working, Kyle said. I had a client deadline, server migration, that needed to be done after business hours. I was on my computer from about 6 until almost midnight. Did you hear anything? See anything? Kyle shook his head. I wear noise-canceling headphones when I work. I heard her come home, her door close. That was around 7:15, maybe 7:20. After that, nothing. I didn't know anything was wrong until Detective Castellano showed up the next morning. Angela's eyes dropped to his left hand. He had a bandage wrapped around his palm, white gauze visible beneath his thumb. What happened to your hand? Kyle glanced down, almost surprised, as if he'd forgotten about it. Oh, that. Wednesday afternoon, I was installing a new server rack for a client. Caught my hand on a metal edge. Sliced it pretty good. Had to get 4 stitches. You have documentation for that? Sure, I went to the urgent care on Main Street. They should have records. Angela made a note. Would you be willing to provide a DNA sample? We're asking everyone in the building. Of course, Kyle said, without hesitation. Whatever helps. This is awful. I can't believe someone did this to her. He signed the consent form right there. Seemed eager to help, actually. Angela had seen guilty people refuse DNA tests, lawyer up immediately, act defensive. Kyle Brennan seemed like exactly what he claimed to be, a shocked neighbor trying to process a tragedy. The DNA sample went to the lab with priority status. Given that they had the killer's blood at the scene, this should have been a quick match if Brennan was their guy. The investigation was just beginning, and what they found would haunt this community for nearly 2 decades. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a case. 3 weeks felt like 3 years. Marcus Castellano spent that time packing up his sister's apartment, a task that nearly broke him. Every item told a story. The half-finished painting on her easel, a sunset over the St. Johns River that she'd never complete. The groceries still sitting out on the counter, tomatoes gone soft, bread growing mold. The ingredients for a family dinner that would never happen. Her phone on the nightstand, the screen cracked from when it had fallen during the attack, the last text message still visible. See you tomorrow, love you. He'd boxed up her clothes, her books, her art supplies. He'd taken down the paintings from her walls. He'd saved everything, unable to throw away even the smallest reminder that she'd existed, that she'd been real, that she'd mattered. And he waited for the DNA results that would bring him justice. When Detective Reeves called him on September 7th, he'd answered on the first ring. We got the results back, she said. Her voice carried a weight that Marcus immediately recognized. This wasn't the call she wanted to make. The DNA profile from the blood at the scene was male. The lab had run it through CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders and arrestees. No match. Whoever killed Veronica had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA collection, or had simply never been caught before. But there was more. Kyle Brennan's voluntary DNA sample came back negative. Not a match. Not even close. Are they sure? Marcus asked, his hand gripping the phone so hard his knuckles went white. Ran it twice, Angela confirmed. It's not him. The bandage, the timing, the access to the building. I thought we had him. But the science doesn't lie. Marcus felt something crack inside him. The one solid lead, the neighbor with the convenient injury and the opportunity, wasn't their killer. They were back to nothing. Angela Reeves ran down every other possibility with the determination of someone who refused to accept defeat. She interviewed Veronica's ex-boyfriends, 2 guys she'd dated casually in the past year. Both had solid alibis, both provided DNA samples willingly, both came back negative. She talked to Veronica's co-workers at the library, her professors from art school, the owner of the gallery that sold her work. No red flags, no jealous rivals, no threatening behavior. Everyone described her the same way. Talented, kind, a little stubborn about her art, but not someone who made enemies. The neighborhood canvas turned up a few fragments of information, but nothing concrete. A resident 3 buildings down reported seeing a dark-colored sedan parked on the street that evening around 7:30, but couldn't recall the make or model. Another witness claimed to have seen a man in a baseball cap leaving Veronica's building around 9 p.m., walking quickly, but the description was vague. White or maybe Hispanic, average height, average build. It could have been anyone. Angela kept coming back to the same conclusions. The door had been locked, no forced entry. Veronica had let her killer inside. The attack was intensely personal. 19 stab wounds spoke to rage, to betrayal, to someone who wanted her to suffer. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to open her door to on a Sunday evening. But who? As summer turned to fall, then winter, the leads dried up. The phone stopped ringing with tips. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and cleared suspects. Angela worked it hard for 6 months, following every thread, but without new evidence, without a name, she was working blind. By the first anniversary of Veronica's death, the active investigation had been reduced to periodic reviews. The files sat in a cabinet with dozens of other unsolved cases, waiting for that one break that might never come. Angela moved on to new murders, new victims, new families desperate for answers. It wasn't giving up, it was reality. Without fresh leads, there was nowhere left to look. But Marcus couldn't move on. He kept his own file, separate from the official investigation. Copies of witness statements, crime scene photos he wasn't supposed to have, his own notes and theories. He drove past Brennan's apartment building sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep. He'd sit in his car and stare up at the windows, knowing logically that the DNA had cleared him, but unable to shake the feeling that something about Kyle Brennan was off. Jessica begged him to let it go, to see a therapist, to stop destroying himself over a case he couldn't solve. But how could he? His baby sister had been butchered in her own home, and her killer was walking free, living his life, probably sleeping soundly at night, while Marcus woke up from nightmares of finding her body. Years passed, 2, then 5, then 10. The Castellano family held memorial services on every anniversary. Diana and Vincent grew older, quieter, the light gone from their eyes. Marcus and Jessica's kids grew up never knowing their Aunt Ronnie except through stories and photographs. And somewhere in Jacksonville, a killer lived free, carrying a secret that should have destroyed him. The case wasn't just cold. It was frozen solid. 18 years is a lifetime. Children are born, grow up, graduate college. People marry, divorce, start over. Careers begin and end. The world moves forward whether you're ready or not. For the Castellano family, time stopped on August 14th, 2005. Every year on that date, they held a vigil at Riverside Park, just 3 blocks from where Veronica had lived and died. Diana would bring Veronica's paintings, the ones she'd once dismissed as impractical dreams, and display them on easels under the oak trees. Strangers would stop to look at the abstract landscapes, the bold colors, the signature VC in the corner. They'd read the poster board that explained what happened to the artist who'd created them. Some would leave flowers, some would cry. Diana Castellano had changed in ways that surprised everyone who knew her. The woman who'd criticized her daughter's choices, who'd wanted stability and safety and traditional success, became an advocate for victims' families. She joined support groups. She spoke at city council meetings about the need for more resources for cold case investigations. She channeled her grief into action because sitting still meant drowning in it. Vincent took a different path. He kept a 3-ring binder, navy blue with Veronica written on the spine in permanent marker. Inside were newspaper clippings from the initial investigation, anniversary articles from years 1 and 5, printouts of online forum discussions about unsolved Jacksonville murders, every mention of his daughter's case he could find. He'd update it religiously, adding new pages, organizing by date, as if proper documentation could somehow bring her back or force the universe to deliver justice. The media coverage, strong in those first weeks, eventually faded like everything does. The 1-year anniversary brought a few newspaper pieces. Riverside murder remains unsolved. The 5-year anniversary warranted a brief local news segment, a reporter standing outside the apartment building asking if anyone remembered anything new. By year 10, there was nothing. Veronica had become a statistic, a name in a file, another unsolved case in a city that had plenty of them. For Marcus, the case became both his purpose and his poison. Jessica had tried to understand at first. She'd given him space to grieve, supported him through the nightmares, tolerated the hours he spent reviewing files that weren't his to review. But by year 3, the obsession had consumed everything. He missed his kids' school plays because he was driving past Brennan's apartment. He forgot anniversaries because he was rereading witness statements for the 100th time. He snapped at his family when they suggested therapy, or moving on, or accepting that some cases never get solved. "You're living in the past," Jessica told him during their final argument in 2008. "Our kids need a father who's present. I need a husband who's here. But you're not. You're stuck in that hallway outside her apartment, and you've been there for 3 years." The divorce was finalized in 2009. Marcus saw his children every other weekend at first, but as they grew older and his behavior grew more erratic, those visits became less frequent. By the time they were teenagers, they'd stopped wanting to spend time with the father who couldn't talk about anything except the aunt they'd never met and the case he couldn't solve. But Marcus couldn't stop. He kept watching Kyle Brennan from a distance, documenting his life even though the DNA had cleared him. When Brennan moved to a different apartment complex in Arlington in 2011, Marcus noted the address. When Brennan changed jobs, Marcus wrote it down. Some part of him knew this was unhealthy, that he'd become the detective version of a stalker, but he couldn't let go of the feeling that Brennan knew something, had seen something, was hiding something. Detective Angela Reeves retired from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office in 2019 after 26 years of service. Before she left, she met Marcus for coffee. She handed him a USB drive across the table. "Everything I have," she said quietly. "Officially, this doesn't exist. Unofficially, you deserve to have it." Marcus took the drive, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry I couldn't solve it," Angela continued. "I think about her case more than any other. But Marcus, listen to me. The DNA is still in CODIS. Every single day, new profiles are added. Arrestees, convicts, volunteers. Technology is advancing. Genetic genealogy is becoming a thing. Don't give up. Someone, someday, is going to get a hit." Marcus wanted to believe her. But after 14 years of waiting, hope felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. He went home that night and plugged in the drive, spent hours going through files he'd already memorized, looking for something he'd missed, some detail that would crack everything open. He found nothing new. The years continued to pass. 2020, 2021, 2022. The world changed, pandemics came and went, technology advanced, but Veronica's case remained frozen. Until 2023, when a discarded coffee cup and a breakthrough in forensic science would finally change everything. 18 years is an eternity for a family waiting for answers. What's the longest cold case you've ever heard about being solved? Drop your stories below. On March 7, 2023, Detective Lisa Huang pulled the Castellano file from the cold case archive. She was relatively new to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office cold case unit, having transferred from Miami-Dade the previous year. But she'd brought something valuable with her: specialized training in forensic genetic genealogy, a revolutionary investigative technique that was solving cases once considered impossible. The method had gained national attention in 2018, when investigators used it to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who'd evaded capture for over 40 years. The technique worked by taking DNA from a crime scene, uploading it to public genealogy databases where people voluntarily submitted their DNA to find relatives, and then using those distant genetic connections to build family trees. Third cousins, fourth cousins, people who'd never met the suspect but shared a common great-great-grandparent, could provide the breadcrumbs needed to narrow down to a specific person. Lisa saw the Castellano case and knew immediately it was perfect for this approach. High-quality DNA evidence from the crime scene. No match in Codice after 18 years of searching. A desperate family that deserved answers, and most importantly, funding. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office had recently allocated money specifically for applying new forensic techniques to cold cases. She contacted Othram Labs, a Texas-based company at the forefront of forensic genetic genealogy. They reviewed the case details and accepted it within a week. The process took 4 months, careful and methodical. The DNA sample from Veronica's apartment, carefully preserved for nearly 2 decades, was sent to Othram's facility. They sequenced it, extracting a genetic profile far more detailed than the standard CODIS markers. This profile was then uploaded to GED Match, a public database where users who'd taken commercial DNA tests could opt in to help law enforcement solve crimes. Lisa worked closely with a genetic genealogist named Margaret Chen, who specialized in building family trees from fragmentary evidence. Margaret started with the matches that appeared, distant relatives who shared small segments of DNA with the unknown killer. A third cousin in Alabama, a fourth cousin in Georgia, another fourth cousin in Tennessee. None of them had any idea they were connected to a murderer. They were ordinary people who'd spit in tubes hoping to learn about their ancestry, never imagining they'd help solve a cold case. Margaret worked backward through generations, census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. She built out family trees branch by branch, looking for the common ancestors these distant cousins shared. It was painstaking work, like assembling a massive puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. By July 2023, the family trees began to converge. Multiple lines pointed to a specific family branch that had roots in northern Florida going back to the 1800s. From there, Margaret narrowed it down to descendants who would be the right age and gender to have committed the crime in 2005. 3 male suspects emerged from the genealogical analysis. The first was Robert Brennan, who had died in a car accident in 2011. Lisa tracked down his widow, confirmed he'd been living in North Carolina in August 2005, had never been to Jacksonville, had alibis from his job as a factory supervisor. Dead end. The second was Michael Brennan, living in Portland, Oregon. Background check showed he'd moved there in 2002 for college and never left. Phone records and employment records from 2005 confirmed he was in Oregon the entire month of August. Another dead end. The third was Kyle Arthur Brennan. Lisa felt her pulse quicken when she saw the name. She pulled the original case file, hands moving faster now, flipping through witness statements and interview transcripts. There it was, Kyle Brennan, resident of apartment 2D, directly across the hall from Veronica Castellano, interviewed on August 17th, 2005. Voluntarily provided a DNA sample. Sample tested. Result, negative, not a match. Lisa stared at the lab report from 2005, then at the genetic genealogy results from 2023. The DNA from Veronica's apartment, the killer's blood, belonged to someone in the Brennan family tree. The genealogy analysis, based on multiple distant relatives and cross-referenced family connections, pointed directly to Kyle Arthur Brennan as the source. But his DNA sample from 2005 said he wasn't a match. Lisa sat back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. Either there had been a catastrophic lab error in 2005, a mix-up or contamination that produced a false negative, or Kyle Brennan had submitted someone else's DNA under his own name. She pulled his background check. Kyle Arthur Brennan, now 46 years old, living in Arlington, Florida. No criminal record. Not even a speeding ticket. He'd worked as an IT consultant for various companies over the years, currently employed by a cybersecurity firm. Married in 2008, divorced in 2015, no children. Ordinary tax returns, ordinary credit history, ordinary life. But genetic genealogy didn't lie. The science was sound. The family trees had been verified multiple times. The DNA from that apartment in 2005 belonged to someone in Kyle Brennan's direct family line, and given the generational timeline and the fact that his two male relatives had been cleared, it pointed to Kyle himself. Lisa made a call to the lab that had processed the original DNA evidence. The supervisor reviewed the chain of custody documentation from 2005. The sample attributed to Kyle Brennan had been logged, processed, and tested. On paper, everything looked correct. But there was no way to retest it now. The original sample had been fully consumed in the testing process, standard practice at the time, which meant one of two scenarios. The lab had made a mistake 18 years ago, possibly mixing up samples in a batch of tests. Or Kyle Brennan, knowing he'd left his blood at the murder scene, had found a way to substitute someone else's DNA when he voluntarily provided his sample. Lisa reviewed the interview transcript again. Brennan had seemed eager to help. He'd signed the consent form immediately. He'd provided the sample right there in the interview room, a cheek swab collected by a detective and sealed in an evidence envelope. Except the detective who'd collected it, Tom Morrison, had retired in 2012 and died in 2018. There was no way to ask him about the process, whether he'd followed proper protocol, whether anything had seemed off. Lisa looked at Kyle Brennan's current address, his employment records, his social media profiles showing a quiet, unremarkable man living an unremarkable life. For 18 years, he'd been hiding in plain sight. He'd lived across the hall from his victim, expressed shock and sadness, volunteered his DNA, knowing it would come back negative, and then simply moved on with his life, while Veronica's family suffered, and Marcus destroyed himself searching for answers. The genetic evidence was undeniable, but Lisa needed more before she could make an arrest. She needed surveillance. She needed current DNA. She needed to build a case that would hold up in court when a defense attorney inevitably pointed to that 2005 test result and claimed mistaken identity. She picked up her phone and called her captain. "We need to talk about the Castellano case," she said. "I know who killed her, and he's been free for 18 years. Detective Lisa Huang didn't want to spook him, After 18 years, Kyle Brennan had lived freely, believing he'd gotten away with murder. One wrong move, one hint that law enforcement was closing in, and he could disappear or lawyer up before they had the evidence they needed to arrest him. The surveillance operation began on July 14, 2023. Plainclothes detectives rotated shifts, watching Brennan's apartment on Southside Boulevard, a modest two-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better days. They documented his movements, photographed him from a distance, built a profile of his daily life. What they observed over 3 weeks was a man who existed more than lived. Brennan worked from home most days, his car remaining parked in its assigned spot for days at a time. When he did leave, it was for practical errands. Publix for groceries, always shopping alone, always the same brands in his cart. Chain restaurants for dinner, usually Panera or Chipotle, eating by himself with his phone for company. A gym membership at LA Fitness that he used 3 times a week, arriving at 6 a.m. when the place was nearly empty, leaving an hour later without speaking to anyone. He had no close friends that surveillance could identify, no romantic partner. No one visited his apartment. He didn't visit anyone else. His social media presence was minimal. A Facebook account he rarely updated, a LinkedIn profile that listed his current employment, and nothing personal. It was a profoundly isolated existence, the kind of life someone builds when they're hiding from human connection or can't sustain it. Lisa wondered if it had always been this way, or if the weight of what he'd done had gradually severed every meaningful relationship until all that remained was this hollow routine. But none of that mattered for the case. What mattered was obtaining a fresh DNA sample from a discarded item, something Brennan had touched and thrown away in a public place where there was no expectation of privacy. The law was clear. Abandoned property was fair game. They waited for the right opportunity. It came on August 3rd, 2023. Brennan left his apartment at 10:17 a.m. and drove to a Starbucks on Beach Boulevard. Detective Huang and her partner, Detective Mike Torres, were on surveillance that morning. They watched from across the parking lot as Brennan went inside, ordered at the counter, and sat down at a table near the window with his laptop and a venti-iced coffee. He stayed for 40 minutes, typing on his computer, occasionally scrolling on his phone, drinking from the plastic cup through a straw. To anyone watching, he was just another remote worker using free Wi-Fi to get through his morning. Nobody would remember him. He was that forgettable. At 11:03 a.m., Brennan packed up his laptop, stood, and walked toward the exit. On his way out, he tossed the coffee cup into the trash can near the door. The cup was still 3/4 full, ice rattling as it landed. Huang waited until Brennan's car had pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down Beach Boulevard. Then she grabbed latex gloves from her vehicle, walked into the Starbucks, and approached the trash can. She could see the cup sitting near the top, condensation still visible on the plastic. She carefully retrieved it, holding it by the bottom, and placed it in an evidence bag that Torres held open. She documented the time, location, and chain of custody on the bag's label. Torres photographed the entire process, everything by the book, everything defensible in court. The cup went directly to the lab with a rush order. 6 days felt longer than the previous 18 years. Lisa tried to focus on other cases, but her mind kept returning to that coffee cup, to the DNA being extracted and analyzed, to the possibility that after nearly 2 decades, Veronica Castellano's family might finally get answers. On August 9th, 2023, at 2:47 p.m., Lisa's phone rang. The lab supervisor's voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of excitement. "You got your match, Detective." Lisa's hand tightened on the phone. "You're certain?" "Completely. The DNA profile from the coffee cup matches the DNA profile from the 2005 crime scene. It's the same person. Statistical probability is 6.7 trillion to 1. Kyle Arthur Brennan's DNA is on that coffee cup, and Kyle Arthur Brennan's DNA was at your murder scene." Lisa closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 18 years lift and settle simultaneously. Justice delayed, but finally within reach. "How soon can you have the written report?" "End of business today." Kyle Arthur Brennan had killed Veronica Castellano on August 14, 2005. He'd stabbed her 19 times in her own bedroom, left his blood at the scene, and then volunteered a DNA sample that had somehow come back negative. Either through catastrophic lab error or through calculated deception, he'd beaten the system. He'd attended memorial vigils. He'd expressed sympathy to neighbors. He'd lived across the hall from the crime scene for years afterward, sleeping soundly while Veronica's family suffered. For 18 years, he'd been free. That was about to end. Lisa called her captain to request an arrest warrant. Then she made another call, one that wasn't strictly necessary, but felt morally required. She called Marcus Castellano. "Mr. Castellano," she said when he answered. "This is Detective Lisa Huang with JSO Cold Case. I need you to sit down. I have news about your sister's case. August 12th, 2023. 6:30 a.m. Detective Lisa Huang stood outside apartment 214 on Southside Boulevard with 6 other officers, all wearing tactical vests, all silent. The arrest warrant was folded in her pocket. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting orange light across the parking lot. Behind her, Detective Torres held the battering ram, just in case. But Lisa had a feeling they wouldn't need it. She knocked. 3 firm raps that echoed through the early morning quiet. 15 seconds passed. Then the sound of footsteps. The door opened. Kyle Brennan stood there in sweatpants and a gray t-shirt, his hair messy from sleep, glasses slightly crooked on his face. For one brief moment, he looked confused, the expression of someone woken unexpectedly. Then his eyes moved from Lisa's face to her badge, to the officers behind her, and the color drained from his skin like water circling a drain. He didn't run. He didn't collapse. He didn't ask what this was about. He just nodded, a small, defeated movement, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment for 18 years. "Kyle Arthur Brennan," Lisa said, her voice steady. "You're under arrest for the murder of Veronica Castellano." She read him his Miranda rights while Torres cuffed his hands behind his back. Brennan listened silently, his face expressionless now, a mask of nothing. When Lisa finished, he spoke his only words, "I want a lawyer." The interview was over before it began. While Brennan was transported to the pretrial detention facility, a forensic team descended on his apartment with a search warrant. They photographed every room, collected his computers and phones, bagged potential evidence. The apartment was neat to the point of compulsive. Everything organized, minimal decoration. No photos of family or friends, just a sterile space where a man had existed in isolation. But the apartment revealed nothing obviously incriminating. No shrine to Veronica, no journal confessions, no trophies from the crime. For hours, the team came up empty. Then Detective Torres found a bill on Brennan's desk. A monthly payment to secure space storage on Arlington Expressway, Unit 147, a storage facility 5 miles away. Lisa obtained an additional warrant and arrived at the facility by early afternoon. The manager provided the key. Unit 147 was climate-controlled, 10 by 10 feet, located at the end of a fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled like concrete and dust. The door rolled up with a metallic screech. Inside were plastic storage bins, stacked neatly, labeled in black marker. Tax documents, 2015 to 2020. Old textbooks, kitchen items, old electronics. Lisa pulled down the bin labeled Old Electronics. It was heavier than it should have been. She set it on the concrete floor and lifted the lid. There were no electronics inside. Instead, there was a shoebox. Plain brown cardboard, the kind that might have once held running shoes. Lisa lifted it carefully, feeling the weight shift inside, and removed the lid. Photographs, dozens of them, all of Veronica Castellano. But these weren't newspaper clippings or memorial photos that anyone could access. These were surveillance photographs, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance, without her knowledge, without her consent. Veronica standing at her easel in her apartment, visible through her window, her face concentrated on her work. Veronica walking to her car in the parking lot, canvas bag over her shoulder. Veronica at Marco's grocery store, reaching for produce. Veronica sitting in Riverside Park with a sketchbook, sunlight in her hair. Veronica laughing at something on her phone. Veronica unlocking her apartment door. Each photograph was dated on the back in neat handwriting. They spanned months. April 2005, May 2005, June 2005, July 2005. The most recent was dated August 13th, 2005. One day before she died, Lisa felt nauseous. These weren't the photos of someone who'd happened to know the victim. These were the photos of someone who'd been obsessed, who'd documented her life without her knowledge, who'd watched her with predatory focus. Torres lifted the photographs carefully, documenting each one. Beneath them, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, was a knife. 9-inch blade, wooden handle. The metal was clean but showed faint discoloration near the base, the kind of staining that came from inadequate cleaning of organic material embedded in the grain where blade met handle. Lisa pulled on latex gloves and carefully unwrapped it. The knife felt heavy, weighted with more than just steel. Field presumptive tests on the handle and blade base came back positive for blood. This was the murder weapon, kept for 18 years, hidden in a storage unit along with the photographic evidence of his obsession. The truth assembled itself in Lisa's mind with horrible clarity. Kyle Brennan hadn't been just Veronica's neighbor. He'd been her stalker, fixated and obsessive, documenting her movements, invading her privacy, building a fantasy around someone who barely knew he existed. He'd photographed her through her windows, followed her on her daily routines, cataloged her life. And when she'd rejected him, or failed to notice him, or simply existed as a real person instead of the fantasy he'd constructed, that fixation had erupted into violence. 19 stab wounds, rage and betrayal from a man who felt entitled to someone who'd never belonged to him. He'd killed her. He'd cleaned the knife poorly and hidden it. He'd kept the photographs as souvenirs. And he'd managed to evade justice for nearly 2 decades because of one crucial DNA test that had somehow cleared him. Lisa stood in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of obsession and murder, and felt a cold fury settle in her chest. Kyle Brennan had stolen Veronica's life, stolen 18 years from her grieving family, and lived freely while pretending to be a concerned neighbor. Not anymore. The forensic team photographed everything, cataloged every piece of evidence, documented the chain of custody with meticulous care. Every photograph, every item in that storage unit, every byte of data on his computers would be used to build the case that would finally bring justice for Veronica Castellano. The evidence was overwhelming, but the community shock was just beginning. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on. We cover cases like this every week. Share this with someone who loves true crime content. The news detonated through Jacksonville like a shockwave. Within hours of the arrest, every local news station led with the story. Cold case solved, 18-year murder mystery ends in arrest. The headlines dominated Facebook feeds, Twitter threads, Reddit discussions. But it wasn't just that someone had been arrested for Veronica Castellano's murder. It was who? Kyle Brennan, the quiet IT consultant who'd lived across the hall, the helpful neighbor who'd volunteered his DNA in 2005, the man who'd expressed shock and sadness, who'd seemed like just another bystander traumatized by violence in his building. He'd been the killer all along. Mrs. Dolores Hampton, now 84 and still living in apartment 2C, gave a tearful interview to News 4 Jax. Her hands shook as she spoke. He seemed so normal, so polite. We all thought it was someone from outside, someone random. But he stood right there in that hallway the day Marcus found her, and he pretended to care. He looked us in the eyes and lied. The stalking photographs added another dimension of horror. Veronica hadn't just been killed. She'd been hunted for months, watched without her knowledge, violated long before that final act of violence. The revelation sent a chill through women across Riverside and beyond. How many times had they walked past a threat they didn't recognize? How many neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances were watching them right now with obsessive intent? On August 15th, 2023, exactly 18 years and 1 day after Veronica's death, the Castellano family held a press conference on the steps of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Marcus stood at the podium, flanked by his parents. He looked exhausted, older than his 47 years, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not peace, exactly, but resolution. "Knowing who killed my sister doesn't erase the loss," he said, his voice steady. "It doesn't bring her back, but it says her life mattered. It says we don't forget. It says justice delayed is still justice." Diana Castellano, now 76, her hair completely white, stepped forward to speak. Her voice carried the strength of someone who'd survived nearly 2 decades of grief. "I want to thank Detective Lisa Huang, Othram Labs, and the forensic genealogists who never gave up on my daughter. To other families still waiting for answers, don't give up. Keep pressure on the system to use these new technologies. Science is advancing. There is hope." Vincent stood silent beside his wife, one hand gripping his navy blue binder, tears streaming down his face. Behind them, Detective Huang watched, knowing that this moment belonged to them, not to law enforcement. Justice had finally found Veronica Castellano. The trial of Kyle Arthur Brennan began on March 4th, 2024, in Duval County Circuit Court. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a veteran jurist known for her no-nonsense approach and meticulous attention to detail. The courtroom was packed every single day, members of the Castellano family in the front row, journalists filling the back, curious onlookers hoping for seats. Defense attorney Thomas Whitmore faced an impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming. DNA that matched at statistical certainty, surveillance photographs documenting months of stalking, the murder weapon hidden in a storage unit for 18 years. Arguing innocence would have been professional suicide. Instead, Whitmore pursued the only strategy available to him. He argued that Kyle Brennan had suffered a psychotic break, that his actions on August 14, 2005, were the result of severe mental illness, not premeditated murder. He brought in a psychiatrist who testified about delusional disorders, about how obsessive thoughts could escalate into violence in someone experiencing a break from reality. Lead prosecutor Jennifer Kwan systematically dismantled that narrative. This was not a psychotic break, she told the jury during opening statements. This was the calculated culmination of months of obsessive stalking. Kyle Brennan didn't suddenly snap. He planned, he watched, he documented. He built an entire secret life around a woman who barely knew he existed. And when she failed to fulfill whatever fantasy he'd constructed in his mind, he killed her. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the DNA evidence first. A forensic specialist explained how the blood found at the crime scene in 2005 had been preserved and eventually matched to Kyle Brennan through forensic genetic genealogy. Then they showed how the DNA from the discarded Starbucks cup in 2023 matched both the crime scene evidence and Brennan himself. The statistical probability was read aloud to the jury. 6.7 trillion to 1. Kyle Brennan's blood was at the murder scene. The stalking photographs came next. One by one, they were displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. Veronica painting at her easel, unaware she was being watched. Veronica walking to her car. Veronica at the grocery store. Veronica sitting in the park. Each photograph dated, each one taken without her knowledge or consent, each one a violation. Marcus Castellano closed his eyes when the photos appeared. He couldn't look at his sister's face, frozen in moments of ordinary life, unknowingly documented by the man who would kill her. Kwan walked the jury through the timeline. For months, Kyle Brennan stalked Veronica Castellano. He photographed her through her windows. He followed her on errands. He learned her routines, her habits, her vulnerabilities. This is not the behavior of someone experiencing a psychotic break. This is predatory. This is calculated. This is a man who felt entitled to a woman, who owed him nothing. The murder weapon was presented in a sealed evidence bag. The knife, still bearing traces of blood despite 18 years of concealment. Forensic analysis confirmed the blade width and length were consistent with Veronica's wounds. Blood on the handle matched her DNA profile. Then came the most damaging evidence of all, the explanation of what had happened with the 2005 DNA test. A forensic expert testified that Kyle Brennan's voluntary DNA sample from 2005 had likely been deliberately contaminated or substituted. Given his IT background and his access to information about forensic procedures, he would have known how DNA collection worked. The expert suggested he may have obtained DNA from another source, perhaps from a stranger's discarded coffee cup, exactly the method police had used to catch him 18 years later, and transferred it to his own cheek swab when the detective stepped away momentarily. The retired detective who'd collected that sample had since died, so the exact method couldn't be confirmed. But the forensic timeline was clear. Brennan had provided a sample that didn't match the crime scene, lived freely for 18 years, and was finally caught when police obtained his actual DNA. The defense called their witnesses. A psychiatrist testified about Brennan's isolated childhood, his difficulty forming relationships, his lack of criminal history prior to the murder. They painted a picture of a lonely, mentally unstable man who'd lost control. But under cross-examination, Kwan exposed the weakness in that argument. Did Kyle Brennan call the police after killing Veronica Castellano? She asked the psychiatrist. No. Did he confess to anyone? No. Did he hide the murder weapon? Yes. Did he keep the stalking photographs as trophies? It appears so. Does that sound like someone who didn't understand what he'd done? Or does it sound like someone who knew exactly what he'd done and wanted to get away with it? The psychiatrist had no answer. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on March 25th. They deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of armed burglary of a dwelling. Guilty of aggravated stalking. Kyle Brennan sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. No visible reaction. The same blank mask he'd worn for 18 years. Sentencing came 2 months later, on May 17, 2024. Judge Morrison addressed Brennan directly before pronouncing sentence, her voice hard and clear. Mr. Brennan, you stole Veronica Castellano's life. You hunted her, violated her privacy, and when she didn't conform to whatever fantasy you'd built in your mind, you murdered her in the most violent way imaginable. You stabbed her 19 times in her own bedroom, a place where she should have been safe. You did this not because you were mentally ill, but because of your selfish obsession, because you believed you were entitled to her attention, her affection, her life. She paused, letting the words settle over the silent courtroom. You spent 18 years as a free man while Veronica's family suffered every single day. You attended vigils. You pretended to mourn. You looked her brother in the eye and lied. That ends today. Judge Morrison sentenced Kyle Arthur Brennan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time since his arrest, Brennan showed emotion. His shoulders sagged. His head dropped forward. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, disappearing through a side door to begin the rest of his life behind bars. Outside the courthouse, the Castellano family stood together in the spring sunlight. Diana held Vincent's hand. Marcus stood between them, his arm around his mother's shoulders. They embraced, not in celebration, but in relief. The weight they'd carried for 18 years hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Marcus gave a final statement to the assembled press. Justice has been served, but it took 18 years. 18 years my sister didn't get to live. 18 years my parents suffered without answers. We need better systems to prevent lab errors or contamination. We need more resources dedicated to cold cases and emerging forensic technologies. Every unsolved case represents a family in pain, a community without closure. Veronica's case is closed now, but thousands more remain open. We can't forget them. He looked directly into the cameras. Don't give up. Don't let them be forgotten. September 14th, 2024, Riverside Park. The group gathered under oak trees draped with Spanish moss, their shadows long in the afternoon light. The Castellano family stood together, Marcus with his arm around his mother's shoulders, Detective Lisa Huang and her team, Angela Reeves, retired but still carrying the weight of the case she couldn't solve, Mrs. Dolores Hampton, leaning on a cane, her eyes red behind her glasses, community members who'd never met Veronica but felt connected to her story. They unveiled a memorial bench overlooking the St. Johns River, the water flowing steady and eternal. A bronze plaque was mounted on the backrest. In memory of Veronica Ronnie Castellano, 1976-2005. Artist, sister, daughter, friend, her light continues. Beside the bench stood an easel with one of Veronica's paintings protected under glass, the unfinished sunset from her apartment, the one she'd been working on the day she died. Another local artist had completed it using Veronica's distinctive style, bold oranges and purples blazing across the canvas, honoring what she'd started but never got to finish. Veronica Castellano placed white roses at the base of the easel, Veronica's favorite. The family sat on the bench together, watching the river flow, constant and indifferent to human grief. 19 years had passed since that August evening. Veronica would have been 48 now. She might have been married, might have had children, might have seen her art displayed in major galleries. All those possibilities died with her. Detective Huang stood apart, reflecting on the strange chain of events that had finally cracked this case. A distant cousin submitting DNA to a genealogy website. Technological advances in forensic science. Budget allocation that allowed cold cases to be re-examined. A discarded coffee cup in a Starbucks trash can. Justice, she'd learned, was as much about luck and timing as investigation and evidence. This was her one solved case out of 6 active files. Already another waited on her desk. A 2003 homicide. Hispanic female, 23 years old, found in a drainage ditch. Cold for 21 years. Another family waiting for answers. The work continued because the dead deserved voices, and the living deserved truth. Veronica wouldn't be forgotten. Her paintings hung in family homes, passed down as precious artifacts of a life cut short. This bench would remain here, overlooking the river she'd loved to paint. People would pause, read the plaque, remember. Cold cases aren't closed cases. Families never stop grieving. But sometimes when science advances and investigators refuse to quit and luck aligns just right, the truth finally emerges from the darkness. Memory holds fast, and in that persistence there is redemption.